Hey everyone, my name is Kris Crawford. I run a channel called Further North Fabrication, and this week we're here at TotalBoat, and we're hanging out with the crew here and working with some carbon fiber. On my channel, I do a lot of woodworking, but more recently I started doing more cafe racer builds. And a lot of time when you're doing custom motorcycles, you're actually building out the frame with materials like carbon fiber right on the motorcycle. So to show you as an example, I actually 3D printed a mold that will be available if you want to try this yourself. This is a mold we're going to be using this week to make a carbon fiber mold for a seat cowl for a cafe racer. A lot of time in the process, when you're making any kind of a plug or a fiberglass mold, you're going to do a negative and a positive. It's a little challenging to do sometimes when you're building off the actual motorcycle. And that's a great use of this method, where we're actually going to wet lay and we're going to do the mold and make everything off of our form as if we would on the motorcycle. I'll show you a couple other tips along the way if you are working right off of your motorcycle. This technique has a lot of different uses as well in other areas, but the first thing we need to do is to prep our mold so we can get ready to lay down our first layer of carbon fiber. Our first real step is to prep our material and prep our surface that we're going to be working off of. So we just cut up some scrap wood, and I'm going to use the TotalBoat, which I'm flicking all over the place, to be able to build this, because we're just looking to do this quickly. So we'll just apply some of that. So this doesn't have to be pretty, and that's the beauty about doing just a little mold like this. We truly just need something to be able to get the plug up off of the ground so we have some room to work and get around it. Like I said, this is a 3D printed piece, and we'll put the link below so you can print this yourself if you are wanting to use this plug and make your own cowl. This is actually a piece that you could just print as is, as a 3D print, and attach directly to your motorcycle, but there's a lot of wasted space. So that's the amazing part about making something like this out of carbon fiber, is you have little cavities and spots that you can hide things like the battery on the bike and all of your electronics. The thing we want to do first is make sure that our form isn't going to stick to the carbon fiber as we're laying down our epoxy. And it's going to be the same process if you're working right off of your motorcycle directly or whatever you're building the form off of. And we'll show you a tip a little later if you don't have flat surfaces to work off of. We're just going to let this sit for a little bit, come back with a chip brush, work in the mold release, and do another quick coat, and then we'll get started on the next part of the process. All we're doing is make sure the mold release is just worked into the plug, and you can kind of see the streaks of it as you brush it, and then we'll add another coat just to balance it out. But that really helps because it just kind of gets it down to some of the spots that might not previously have gotten. If I could change anything about this model though, I'd actually round the edge a little bit more. Sometimes when you're folding things like carbon fiber, if you have a better, rounder mold, it actually lays a little bit better, but there's some tricks in doing that, which we'll show you a little bit later. When you're doing a plug like this, your top layer is your show layer, your bottom layers are basically your strength layers. The biggest surface that we need to worry about is our top surface. Before we get too far, I'm going to make basically a template out of masking tape, so we have something that we can go back and cut our last piece for. When we're putting on our last piece, that means we can get our nicest show layer possible with as minimal seams as we can get. Now, the reason I did the mold release first is I really don't want this to stick too hard. So all I'm doing is folding the tape underneath, just so it just kind of tacks, because we're going to pull this off, draw some lines, and use this to make a flat template. This is a good example to why you'd want to make a template. As you can see, as I'm going up, the tape isn't pulling as well. So that ends up being bunchy extra material on the final layer, which we want to avoid. So we'll be able to, of course, shape that with our template that we're making out of the final piece of carbon fiber. I personally cannot draw a straight line with a ruler. One of the tips that I often do is I actually use the edge of a Sharpie, not the actual tip of the Sharpie, when I'm trying to trace something. So all I'm doing is riding that edge with the Sharpie, as opposed to trying to like stay on it with the tip of the actual marker. And then that way, you're basically using the ledge of the piece to get your line. And the reason we're doing this is, again, like we want to have that exact piece, or as close to that exact piece as we can for that finished layer. Now that we have this, before I take it off, I'm just going to mark with the knife along that edge as well, because there's going to be a couple spots where we're going to have a bend. The biggest one, of course, is going to be around the top half of the cowl. So I want to basically cut up almost all the way. And then when I cut my piece, I'll make it basically so we have tabs that fold under to be able to have as even as a seam as we can get. Like I said, we're gonna leave this because we want this to be one piece, but you'll see what I mean once we pull off the plug. The big reveal. Now this oddly shaped piece becomes the template that we'll use later when we are cutting out our last piece. Okay, well, I'm done for the week. It's good seeing you guys. And, yeah, that's my template. Our next step is to do our rough layers, the first couple layers of the carbon fiber. So we're gonna prep some TotalBoat high performance and start from there as far as getting down our first few layers of the carbon fiber. Okay, this is one of the first tricks I'll share about cutting carbon fiber. I've marked out 16 inches. All I'm gonna do is just nick the little thread on each end that holds it together. And I wanna cut this as straight as possible. Find one of the fibers in that 16-inch mark. And I'm just gonna pull one of the threads out. Now, if you look at the weave, there's like a perfect line all the way down because of the spacing where I know I'll be able to cut the carbon fiber. We're using release fabric underneath as we are wetting out the carbon fiber. You can just use a clear garbage bag though, that you cut open and you just have one layer of. But the idea is that we want to get this to a point where the epoxy starts to kick a little bit. It's a little bit warm, it's going to be a little bit stiffer, and it's going to stick and mold to our form a little bit better. If we just threw this on right away, it wouldn't mold and shape as easily as it would if we let it set for a while. So patience is key. We're going to wet it out and wait a bit and then put it onto our mold. We lay down a sheet of vacuum bagging film just so we have a surface that we can wet out our carbon fiber with, and we're using the high performance epoxy with a medium cure time. The reason we want to do this in this way is we want the epoxy to start to kick a little bit before we actually lay it down. That way it's going to hold a lot better shape to the form. I absolutely love the fact that you can get pumps for your TotalBoat epoxy. This makes things a lot easier. Of course, our cups have measuring devices on the side so you can do that, but when you're just mixing up small batches, it's so much easier just to count out how many pumps you're doing so you know you have the right ratio. Really not too worried about introducing air bubbles into this, so I'm whipping it pretty aggressively. If you're doing any kind of like a tabletop or your smooth coat, it's better to do it in such a way where you're pulling out as many air bubbles as possible and not introducing the air in the way that I am. But we're gonna wait. Once it gets a little warm, you know it's gonna be ready for us to actually put onto the piece. So we'll watch our cup just to see what it does, but we'll wet this out right away and go from there. This part I don't want to be rough with though. The rougher you are, the more you're going to pull at the carbon fibers. So you want to just really gently do this with a chip brush, and I'm putting no downward pressure. I'm just really dragging the brush along the material just to move it around as much as possible. And I want to try and get it as even as possible too. I also don't need to go right to the edge just because of the way I've measured this. I'm going to have some overhang. Now that we've let the epoxy sit on the carbon fiber for a little while, we're going to take it over to our piece and we're going to carefully lay it out. I'm going to put down the side that I added epoxy to, so the part that was facing the mat, and I'm going to do my best not to distort our weave. And again, this is our first layer, so it doesn't matter as much how pretty this is because the last layer is the show layer. So I'm just adding a little bit more epoxy just to the front, just to add a bit of weight so it kind of pulls down a little bit around our form. Now we're gonna add our second piece dry, and the reason we're gonna do this is we'll put another layer of the epoxy on top, but this way this will help each of the layers stick to each other, and this piece I'm not fighting with as much as I lay it down. But here's a good tip. You always want to make sure that those extra threads are not in the way, because that will make for a bad day. These rollers are absolutely clutch when you're doing any of these kind of things, especially on these inner surfaces, because if you're trying to push in with your fingers, you'll for sure distort the weave. So the roller is really nice just to kind of help move the material around without moving the weave around too much. I'm gonna carefully float on a thin coat of, again, the high performance, just so there's a bit of weight, but also just to hold everything a little bit better. This helps really hold down the edges as well. Again, just because of the weight of the epoxy sitting in the carbon fiber materials. Carbon fiber, fibers of carbon fiber. Say that a billion times fast. Now, one thing to watch for in this is where your high spots are versus your low spots. Just because when you're adding extra layers, you don't want to have pockets. So what I try and do as best as I can is try and get the coating as even as possible. And for me, the easiest way to see that is you can tell the difference in the gloss in the material, where some spots will look just a little drier. So make sure you don't have any puddles, move those around while you can, and try and smooth it out in a way where you're not really distorting the fabric. Well, this has been sitting for a little while. We cut our last two pieces of the carbon fiber. At the beginning, we did do our tape template, and the carbon fiber is actually shaping really well to the cowl, so we're not actually going to do that step, but remember that, because that's a great way to cut out your carbon fiber when you are doing molds like this, when you have really steep angles. We're now at our last layer, which is our show layer. So I will be very careful in how I lay this down, making sure that I do as little as I can to distort the weave. But we went 4 layers, and we'll see tomorrow once it's dry, just how strong it is, and obviously how light it is because it's carbon fiber. A lot of times when I'm cutting my pieces and I'm actually molding onto the motorcycle frame, with all of my loose ends, I'll use blue tape and I'll tape those down as well. It just gives it a little bit more stretch and a little bit more, I guess, pull on that carbon fiber, so it really takes the shape as best as it can. We've let this sit for a little bit, so I'm gonna do a little bit of a top coat. After this is done, we'll probably use some tabletop epoxy just to add that smoothing final layer. But for now, I'm just gonna use up some of the extra epoxy that I have just to weigh this down a little bit and make sure that everything stays where it needs to be as everything cures. If you tuck it under too much, you gotta remember that the epoxy is gonna help the carbon fiber form to that. And when that happens, like, I have to cut this out of the mold, and if I'm too wrapped around the piece, it's gonna be a nightmare to get everything off. Here's that tip I mentioned earlier. When you are working on the motorcycle, typically doing this technique, you're working right off the frame. And when you're working right off the frame, there's a lot of holes on that back seat hoop. So this is where vinyl wrap comes in. And what I have done lots is just take a good car vinyl wrap, is stretch it and pull it over top of the seat hoop, basically to build a layer where I have a flat surface and I can use a heat gun to stretch it out. So when I'm laying down my carbon fiber, it allows me to have a nice flat surface to work off of between the space of the 2 bars on the seat hoop. We are back on day 2, and carbon fiber is dry. The 4 layers went down really, really well, and the plan is to trim off all the extra. So part of the reason why this was attached just temporarily to the form was so we had something that we could remove and work with a little bit more easier. When I go back and shape this, I will probably temporarily attach it again, but we need to trim the edge. So if you're feeling like getting a workout, obviously you can use cutters to do that, but we're gonna go over to the metal shop and use an angle grinder to take off the extra carbon fiber. Cowl's now out of the mold, and we're ready to move on to the next step. And here's a great tip for you when you're trying to measure out an equal distance around basically your frame, or in this case, the cowl that we're using. And that just simply takes TotalBoat's new hot glue system, Total Hot, and a chunk of wood, and of course a felt marker. And what I'm gonna do is I've already made just a bit of a mark on the cowl where I want my cut to be. And what I'll do is I'm gonna glue the marker onto my block of wood. So what's now able to do is act as a template with the same angle and the same spacing around the whole entire piece. For our back section, I'm gonna put the plug back in and use that to connect my line. And then once that's done, we can go back over to the metal shop and get our final shape. And just like that, we have our finished piece ready to go for our flood coat. But before we do that, because we were grinding and taking care of all the extra trim of carbon fiber, we of course want to use a wax and grease remover to get rid of that, so there's nothing trapped under our final layer of epoxy. So we're at more or less our final step in the process, which excitingly enough, we'll be doing on the TotalBoat's Instagram channel during the live. So if you want to see what that process was, definitely check that out. But we are going to be applying the tabletop epoxy just for a final coat on the piece, and that should be done. What some people will do after they've completed a piece like this is they will go to paint, sometimes maybe leaving some of the carbon fiber exposed. But after you've completed something like this with a flood coat of epoxy, it's basically good to go. UV protection is important too, so you want to make sure that after it's off gas, you add something to it. But other than that, we are done the process. And for the flood coat, we are going to use the tabletop epoxy. The reason we're going to use the tabletop epoxy is because it is a little bit thicker. The idea being that we can build up a nice, clean, even layer with that, with minimal runoff. It doesn't cure as fast as the high performance, but in this application, we think it's going to be super helpful to help us lay out as even of a surface as possible. Now that we're done with the tabletop epoxy, we're gonna let this sit for about 5 days before we apply the Halcyon. That's so we can make sure that the material has through cured all the way, so we're not locking anything in when we do our top coat. So if you caught the Instagram live, you saw that we did the flood coat. Before we did that, we made sure to sand the material just so we were able to get the best bond between the two epoxy surfaces. And the reason I use Halcyon for something like this, just because of the simplicity of it. You can build up lots of coats and you can add additional coats in the future. So it's just a very user-friendly product to work with compared to using an HVLP sprayer and some sort of a two-part lacquer or anything like that. This is also a UV resistant product, so it'll definitely, when you're riding into the California sunset, your motorcycle will be as protected as possible. I'm not from California though. If you are interested in making your own C-Pan using this 3D printed mold, I'll make sure that TotalBoat adds the link in the description. If you are looking for any of the products used in this video, you can find those at TotalBoat.com. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those below. And big thanks to TotalBoat for letting us work on this project this week. If you want to follow along on any of the projects that I'm doing, either with woodworking or some of the motorcycle builds, you can find me on Instagram at Further North Fab, or here on YouTube at Further North Fabrication. Thanks again to TotalBoat for letting us work this week together and play around with some of the awesome products that they offer, and we'll see you on the next video.